Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm here with Anand Hira, venture partner at IBOS Ventures and the founder of his own B2B startup, Zycara. We're here today to talk about the globalization of the startup ecosystem. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that's been driven by the pandemic, but I think Anand and I would both agree, although Anand, I will defer to you, that globalization in terms of the startup ecosystem happened a long time ago.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast, Eric. Really appreciate it. And in terms of globalization and the startup ecosystem, to me, like you said, it's been an ongoing thing, so to speak. Especially with talent in various countries, especially from my original hometown in India, being a relative tech hub to throughout Asia and Europe. But to me, really, what the pandemic did is accelerated adoption, right? Like it's always been there. We've always had a need for talent, but the kind of steps that early stage, especially earlier stage companies would take to, identify talent was always a little challenging, I would say. But again, when the pandemic hit, we all were forced into this remote lifestyle, and proliferation of Zoom, as we're using today, has really changed the way we reach and communicate with peers across the world. So, as a founder myself, I've really noticed that a lot of communication gets started on, LinkedIn or various job board or whatever it may be, and the next day we're talking in terms of fit and identifying whether that talent makes sense. So, I think looking back, this pandemic really has changed for the good, the way we communicate and engage with talent throughout the world.
It's interesting. I think you hit three different points, right? You mentioned talent, you mentioned technology, and I think the third one that I kind of want to probe you on, actually, as a venture partner, is: do you think that this decentralization of startups is going to have a positive or negative impact for you, well, either as a venture partner or as a startup founder? I think maybe let's start with the venture partner. Do you see any super positive benefits or drawbacks right now with that decentralization or globalization?
I'll tackle that from two perspectives. As a source of capital, this has obviously created more competition when it comes to global capital and sovereign funds that can now pretty much really reach any startup at any stage today and kind of compete for that investment. And as a venture capitalist investing in an early stage company, I think the access to global talent that presumably drives costs down in most cases, and with a relative comparable talent pool, I think it's a good thing. Anytime a startup can stretch their dollar to get more resources is ultimately going to drive them closer to their end goal, right, of achieving that next milestone. So I think on balance, it's a great thing. I think what we will be doing and will need to continue to do is be thoughtful about how we differentiate ourselves, right? Whether it's as a founder and as a venture capital firm, we need to start highlighting our kind of pluses, our real, unique experience in terms of separating ourselves from competition.
Interesting. One thing I've always wondered, because I've talked to a lot of startup founders, a lot of them have had to, they have their development teams overseas, usually in their home countries. So for instance, a friend of mine was from Morocco, his dev team's in Morocco. I have a friend in Canada, his dev team is in Canada, but he's now in the EU. Do you think that that people without maybe those home connections can build those strong development teams purely by using technology? Or do you need to at least meet every once in a while for in person, right? And I think that's what a lot of my start founder friends said. It's like, hey, I've done my 2 or 3 years in Silicon Valley, built up the VC network and my industry connections, and now I can go back home, but I need to be there in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
It's really, first of all, my dev team for Zycara is in India as well. And so that's obviously, or maybe not obviously, my family birth country. I would say really it's an individual case. It really depends on your level of communication sophistication. And what I mean by that is, even from having an Indian descent, there's different business practices that go on in our home countries that we tend to maybe not evolve with when we grow up in another country. So that's one thing that maybe doesn't really benefit going back to your original country. I would say the second thing is, if someone who's looking to acquire talent from a country, like India or Morocco, wanted to do that, or Eastern Europe being a popular destination, I do think it's important to have someone in your team that can kind of be not only a guide, but like a translation piece in terms of, someone may do or say something in a certain way and it may not fit culturally, but it's something that can always be worked on. So I do think it's certainly beneficial that you can go back and acquire talent at a reasonable, I guess, price point, so to speak, to kind of have to commoditize it. But I do think it's really important to have some insights into the local kind of means of doing business and communication styles as well. So there's no real, I think one of the biggest challenges is the drop off in translating the business idea or, the product idea from the business team to the, whoever the project manager is, or the lead for the development shop or team. So I think it's a great thing overall, but something to be just very cautious about in terms of having some level of understanding of how things work.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's why lots of national governments, they have those trade offices to kind of help facilitate, although they probably focus more on like the process. But I think you hit the nail on the head with culture, right? Speaking of culture, do you think that having a globalized team, it's harder to build a unique culture, or is it easier? And does it actually have advantages for the business over the long term?
Sure. So I can speak to my experience with Zycara itself. I would say it's very beneficial for us because we have, first of all, we are a small team at this stage, so it's relatively manageable. I think it really depends on the personalities that you bring in, whether it's, domestically or internationally, who are open-minded, right? So I think it depends on the mindset of the team. But for us specifically, we share cultural experiences, cultural differences, and it kind of creates, a bond between us, and not only understanding each other, but really kind of creating camaraderie from our personal experiences. I think overall people enjoy learning new things. And so being able to share different cultural experiences in our, the downtime that we have in communication is really important for just feeling like you're part of something that's bigger than just your box, right? I think it adds to that dynamic in terms of being a team. So I would say it's been pretty fluid for me. I can see where as you scale, it becomes more and more of a challenge. Especially again, like I said, on the communication front. But I think with thoughtful management, it's a net positive, I would say.
Interesting. I think one of the things that you hit upon in terms of technology, I think you kind of highlighted, you could potentially build that connectivity with LinkedIn and to find, let's say, your development team, etc. Do you think that where we are from a technological perspective, we are where we need to kind of like further decentralize the startup ecosystem, or do we need to go further? I mean, everyone knows Meta is trying to do the metaverse.
Yes.
So, like, do we need like enough? Do we need the metaverse in order to further decentralize, or is there? I mean, we've talked a lot about culture. Is there that human factor that we'll always need, whether it be over Zoom or in-person meetings or a combination of the two?
Well, I will start off by saying that I do think a hybrid approach is going to be, the norm in terms of having that team and working environment. I would say where we're at today is obviously we're at, at a major inflection point in terms of where we go from here, from everything we've been through over the last almost 2 years now. But I would say where we're at is a healthy place. I think the more and more we become less personal with our peers and our team, I do think that can lead towards certain mental health aspects that are probably not talked about enough. One of my passions on the side is, of course, mental health, personally, through various affiliations and relationships. But I think if we're going to talk about, what we need to do to decentralize more, is that a path forward? I would personally say no. I think having the ability to communicate on Zoom or whatever platform is good enough. I don't think we need to start, becoming less and less personal by having, fictional animations or creations of ourselves in a different universe to express ourselves. I think we can express ourselves pretty fluidly by being us in the real world. Although, I do see the benefits of having that, but I don't know in the work environment if that's really, I don't know, we'll see. Actually, to be honest, I think I'm taking a wait and see approach on that. But personally, I do feel being able to, speak face to face is important, whether it's on Zoom or in person. And I do think some component of in person is very important as well, because body cues, the high five, that experience together of being together, you can't really replace that with technology. And that's kind of where I fall.
I would be inclined to agree with you. So, I mean, we've kind of talked about let's call it the extreme example of, for instance, in California and India. But if we look just within the United States, we're also seeing that migration from Silicon Valley in New York City to other hubs like Miami, Austin, and even smaller hubs depending on their internet connectivity. Do you foresee within that, let's say, frontier markets, do you see the continued growth, or do you think there'll be something that will arrest it? Because at least for larger corporates, to your point, we're seeing a lot of hybrid work, but they're saying, hey, I have to come in 3 days a week and then 2 days remote. But if I have to come into an office, is there office nearby? I don't know, I'm going to make this up, Oklahoma City. So do you foresee a continuing growth in terms of those, let's call them frontier tech hubs, or do you see something that will reverse that in the short and long term?
Great question. In the short term, I do see with just how much activity is going on, especially I can speak to the startup ecosystem. I think it's expanding dramatically. Again, probably tied to the amount of capital flowing through the system. So as long as that remains relatively on par, I think having the multiple hubs is only just going to expand the interest into the ecosystem. When I mean that, like by the tech ecosystem. So like Silicon Valley will always be the premier hub, and I do notice that a lot of individuals who moved out due to the pandemic are moving back. But I do see those hubs as kind of here to stay. I don't think anything can really derail that as long as the energy and the foundation from which they were built remains. So, again, there's active founders and investors in those hubs. there will always be people looking to start new companies and will, I would say relatively on default, veer towards the hub that's closest to them that they maybe. And another aspect is, of course, the culture around those hubs, right? People kind of tend to flock towards something that's more in line with them and their personality. So I do think that's not only a beneficial aspect, but something that will keep those hubs remaining relatively strong.
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? In terms of, for instance, Silicon Valley, yes, there's a lot of, let's call it platforms and software focus, whereas Boston, for instance, is a bit more biotech. New York is financial services. Miami is crypto. So not only is it in terms of different verticals, but it's also in terms of personalities, right? And that's always a good thing for, to your point, the startup ecosystem. The more diversity we have, more ideas we have, more chances for the next unicorn and decacorn out there. So that's super interesting. But from a venture partner perspective, doesn't that make it more difficult to find the next pre-seed startup to invest in so you can be part of that decacorn or unicorn?
Sure. I think it goes back to, one of the original topics that we discussed is the connectivity today. I don't think it's more challenging. I do think it's important to have just more eyes on the ground at these hubs is important. So being thoughtful about where you're sourcing, deal flow in terms of having a local, maybe there's 5, 6, 7 places where you need to keep track of. So building a relationship in those areas where you have eyes on the ground is somewhere where you can offset that, and it gives more opportunity as well for our fund. I think outside of that, there's really, I don't think any difference. Like, you have to build your venture brand, right? You have to attract a reason for early stage companies to want your capital as much as, especially for describe the high flyers, the ones who have, the potentials written everywhere, right? You still have to build that brand, and wherever you're located has no relevance to that. But I would say that it can be challenging because you do have to make sure you network very well across the space. But there's plenty of opportunity and plenty of activity and a lot of platforms that kind of just give you that access no matter where you're located. So
it's interesting. You kind of highlighted the benefits in terms of what we see in terms of globalization or decentralization of the startup ecosystem. Have you, whether as a venture partner or as a startup founder, have you run into any drawbacks or pitfalls that you hope will be smoothed out in the future, whether it be movement of money or setup of corporations, etc., or even just paying taxes? Has that been a major issue, or has it been something that's inconsequential at the moment?
I will say at the moment it's relatively inconsequential. One example on the downside, not necessarily on the downside, but it has opened up room for a lot of fraud from international investors or claiming to be international investors. I actually experienced this back in February, I believe. There was a supposedly big fund out of Thailand. And so, in terms, and after doing, extensive due diligence, it just wasn't going to be something that I was going to get involved with. So, the connectivity does open up room for, let's say, bad actors to take advantage of the distances while also kind of presenting like they kind of belong. So I think with a careful eye, it shouldn't be a problem, but I can see how it can turn into a growing and larger problem as the amount of capital, again, that's sloshing around the system kind of incentivizes, not to like dissect it down to poor nations or whatnot, but there are opportunities that they see that are coming out of the US. And so they're becoming more and more sophisticated about how they can tap into that somehow, one way or another. So that is a potential downside, but I think, overall, it's still a relatively small number. And I think, everyone is ultimately responsible for the decisions they make. That's, my personal philosophy. And, even with crypto and everything else, like, I do think that, if you allow yourself to do something without doing the proper research, then, that falls on you to a degree.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that I've always stated is that as much as we try to impose rules and regulations on everyone, because we're human, will find a way around the rules and regulations. Just depends on how much you pay your lawyers.
Oh, that's for sure. Even on a micro level, like, when we make up our minds on something, it's on us to learn. Hopefully we learn with less painful outcome if it does go south, but and that, I guess, that could tie into a whole nother conversation about the education system and all that, but we'll save that for another time.
Trust me, that is a favorite topic of mine, because I think that is the root source of many ills in our current society, but I digress there. Speaking of, in terms of if we think that globalization of the startup ecosystem is a good and positive benefit, which I think both you and I agree on, are there things that major actors, whether it's the government or big tech or even NGOs, can do to kind of further entrench it and accelerate that participation, whether from a local level or national level or even international level?
Great question. I think, let's start with the government, especially local governments. I do think, and they may exist, I'm just maybe not as familiar, but I do think having some support in terms of, the vetting process, whether it's through the government or through an independent organization where, there are a lot of companies out there for freelance work, Fiverr, Upwork, all that, which is great, right? And they kind of deal with a lot of the reliability question mark, right? But I think if we have more support on that front, especially for longer term hires, that could be really beneficial. How would that look? I would say, on the government front, some sort of, database system where, people looking to work in the US for US companies can kind of apply to a centralized system. That system can vet that individual, and then companies here can leverage that system rather than trying to find one-off situations. I think maybe just streamlining that whole process for businesses in the US can be, pretty interesting and helpful solution. And as far as big tech goes, I think they're actually, ironically enough, driving the globalization in a different way. And what I mean by that is, from what I know, Google, Apple, Facebook, the like, are really aggressively recruiting continuously, even beyond their quote unquote headcount needs, and they're really filing away a lot of strong talent. And so because of that, early stage companies are having less and less opportunities to recruit. And so we have to look elsewhere, right? So I think that's an interesting dynamic that's been playing out for some time. So I don't know whether, they're incentivized to streamline that. I know for themselves they would be, but I don't know. What do you think about that, actually? I'd love to kind of get your take on that.
It's interesting. I think there's a lot of things that can be done to help streamline. I kind of like your database idea, right? Or at least some type of validation system, right, in order to smooth and simplify. And I think this goes back to the tension between privacy of the individual and also interconnectivity of governments, right? I think your analysis in terms of big tech is interesting. I never thought of it that way, but it does make sense because you all gravitate towards the big names. They do really great advertising. It's like the FANGs, right? They pay really well, exactly. But I think it also opens up opportunities for governments to plug the hole and say, hey, why don't we fund, going back to your education comment, people that can hit the ground running, have the actual skill sets we need. And I'm not necessarily advocating for STEM, but I think you and I could agree that, yeah, you can get an engineer out of Harvard, but I still have to provide some type of training to get them to code what I need them to code, right?
For sure.
So I think it's building more of those fundamental foundations. So whether it's educated, useful employees, whether it's broadband connectivity, whether it's reducing the overhead burden. So the question I was asking and alluding to is, the taxes. It's like, do I have to register in every state if I want someone working in Utah, or can I just do it one simple thing and it's covered everywhere, right? Because I don't want to spend my money on overhead. I want to spend my money on building a product and selling the product. So I think there's a lot of efficiencies. And it's funny because when you say the word efficiency in government, that scares a lot of people because it's like, oh, we're just going to cut everything. It's like, no. I'm all for a transparent, accountable system. I don't need 10,000 people backing it. I need a database that is automated that I can access 24/7. So that's my 2 cents, in all honesty. I think there's a lot of efficiencies that both big tech and startups themselves are driving. And I think this globalization that we see in the startup ecosystem is helping to drive that. Now, that being said, it scares a lot of people. And I think the big question, which again is another topic, is what do we do for those in transition, right? I've asked my startup friends this, and they say, oh, they'll get re-educated. Well, it's kind of hard for a 55-year-old coal miner in Pennsylvania to get re-educated in coding. Not to mention, you kind of indirectly told them that they're useless when you've totally forgotten they've raised a family, built a community, participated in church, and those are valuable things for society beyond their job. So, but that's my 2 cents. But usually with my podcast, I usually leave my guests with the final words. So any final thoughts in terms of globalization and startups that you want to impart to our audience?
Well, I want to also conclude by thanking you, Eric, again, for having me on. I think ultimately globalization is here to stay. And so it's better to be on the accepting side of things and help shape the framework for it, rather than, kind of resist and fight it. And I think any temporary, geopolitical reason or whatever it may be, speed bump will be just that. And so because of that, I think, as a founder and as an investor, I think it's just important to be very thoughtful about how you approach the world and kind of just educate yourself on the subtle differences around various regions and kind of take a step back and reflect on how that could be a value add to you rather than kind of looking at it as, more competition or more of an axe to grind, so to speak. But I think overall, just having the mindset of embracing it is going to be critical to kind of evolve with where we're heading, in my opinion. So thank you for that.
Perfect. Well, thank you, and I look forward to having future conversations with you. But thank you again for participating in the podcast.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was definitely a pleasure.